We're joined today by MEP Reinhard Bütikofer, a member of Germany's Green Party and chair of the European Parliament's delegation on China. Reinhard, welcome.
How are you? I'm happy to be with you.
Good. Thanks for joining us. Maybe we'll start off with the recent sanctions that were imposed on you by China. You were one of several MEPs. Is that correct?
Indeed, 5 MEPs from the 4 big democratic groups in the European Parliament have been sanctioned. In addition to that, a couple more individuals, among them 3 members of the Dutch, Belgian, and Lithuanian parliaments, and a number of researchers and political institutions, including the Human Rights Subcommittee of the European Parliament.
And what exactly do those sanctions entail for you personally?
Well, the Chinese have imposed those sanctions without pointing to any legal basis for that action. So I guess the sanctions mean whatever the Communist Party intends them to mean, and I would say it's something that we will find out in practice, but they have said that the sanctioned people are not allowed to travel to China, including our families are prevented from traveling to China. And we're also not allowed to do business with China. The latter part is not so troublesome for me.
And I suppose maybe for our audience, could you explain how it got to the point of individual MEPs being sanctioned, how we went from late last year for the comprehensive agreement on investment being agreed in principle to where we are now?
Yeah, that's an interesting story because if you look at it superficially, it could be understood as a kind of a turnaround. But in reality, it's more complicated. When the comprehensive agreement on investment was finalized in principle just before the turn of the year, that came under very strong pressure from the German and the French leadership. And even though there were misgivings with quite a few other member states, nobody wanted to stand up and to incur the wrath both of Merkel and Macron and Xi Jinping at the same time. So basically they pulled it off in an untimely manner. And as it then turned out, not continuing the negotiations came with a price. And it came with a price, for instance, of not having found adequate language to deal with the issue of forced labor in China, which is imposed at a very broad scale on the Uyghur minority, particularly in Xinjiang, in the far northwest of China. And the public conversation very fast focused on that issue, zeroed in on that point. And I mean, it's not hard to understand that from our point of view, we cannot just say, okay, it's not a problem being complicit with forced labor. I mean, maybe we should use a more striking name. This is modern slavery. We cannot just say this is a side affair. This doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters ethically and it matters economically. So the criticism grew very strong, and then the reports, of course, about the atrocities in Xinjiang came raining every day, basically. So that led to a situation where the European foreign ministers thought that they should signal to the Chinese that they were also unhappy with that, and they meant to impose relatively lenient, relatively cautious sanctions. But the Chinese side then obviously felt, and this has been explained in the nationalist media in China very explicitly, they felt that they should teach Europe a lesson, that they should tell the Europeans that it was now China's turn to dictate the framework conditions of a conversation. And it was for China to decide what the European Union was allowed to discuss and to debate. And they picked individuals that have been involved with Xinjiang. They picked individuals that have been involved with Hong Kong, with supporting the democracy movement in Hong Kong. They picked individuals that have been involved with showing solidarity with Taiwan against China's threats. They have picked individuals that have been strongly involved with human rights issues across the board. So they basically sent one central message. Whatever we define to be off limits for you, you're not allowed to discuss, not even in the parliament. Free speech doesn't apply to China, even in your own country. And of course, that is a bit over the edge. That's an imperialist kind of attitude, and that doesn't go well with a self-confident European Parliament.
And as we know, the European Parliament, the reaction to the sanctions was the passing of a landslide passing of a motion to essentially freeze the deal. I suppose in your own view, is the deal essentially dead, or what needs to happen, I suppose, to get it back on the table?
Well, the deal is dead for the moment. But as they say, even a week can be a long time in politics. And it's quite obvious that China is trying to work on overturning the present state of play. So they are inviting foreign ministers and try to induce them to say positive words about the deal. And the Irish foreign minister just visited Beijing and did them the favor. And they are, Xi Jinping personally is calling up European leaders like Sanchez in Spain and trying to argue with them. I also have the very strong impression that Merkel is still pushing hard. She's on her last legs. She will be out of office in October. But if she can pull something off, I think she would have the audacity to try to do so. So there will be efforts to overturn the decision of the European Parliament. But as you said, we had a majority of 599 votes in favor and just, I think, 40 or 30 votes opposed. So it will be a tough battle. And all the democratic political groups in the European Parliament are very much aligned in saying, if the Chinese want us to deal with an agreement, then they have to get rid of the sanctions. That's not promising if they abandon the sanctions, we'll pass the deal. We will then return to all the issues that we have with the deal on substance. And apart from the issues that I've already mentioned as pertaining to the use of forced labor in China, where the European Parliament has clearly expressed already in the past that we want a change there before we can even think of possibly ratifying, there are other issues too. So for instance, we're affording China a national treatment as regards the media, while China is still keeping its media market completely shut for Europeans. Is that fair? Or there is a provision in the deal that would allow China to be even more restrictive in clamping down on European NGOs that has been foreseen in the 2017 Foreign NGO law. So basically, the European Commission has been signaling to China that we're willing to throw NGOs under the bus for some economic benefit. That's not going to go down well with the European Parliament either. So even if the sanctions would be lifted, it would not be an easy ride.
Yeah, and you mentioned there Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney's visit to his Chinese counterpart over the weekend. I wondered, what was your takeaway from that visit and your general view of Ireland's approach to China?
I'm a bit reluctant there because I can't really claim that I have followed Ireland's China policy very closely. So I may be lacking a lot of important information, but I was struck by the fact that the Irish foreign minister and the Polish foreign minister and also the Portuguese and the Hungarian foreign ministers all did China this one favor. From one foreign minister at least, and that was not the Irish one, I have been told that internally he said, well, there's no way of moving the agenda forward with regard to CAI unless you lift the sanctions. He has not, that particular foreign minister has not said so in the public, but he claims to have said that in private, behind closed doors. I'm not sure what the Irish foreign minister said in that regard. Maybe you should ask him.
I do know after the meeting there was a statement released, and in that he kind of alluded to the need for more constructive dialogue between the EU and China, I suppose, to kind of resolve the issues that are at hand. Is there constructive dialogue going on in the background, or what is the way forward for the Parliament's delegation on China?
Well, I'm a bit suspicious with regard to that kind of language, because when the Chinese say constructive dialogue, they mean let's focus on the issues where we don't have disagreements and let's put the disagreements to the side. I don't agree with that approach because the disagreements are so fundamental and so relevant that we cannot ignore them just for the benefit of some short-term economic gains. I mean, there still is a perception around Europe that whoever wants to be a big player in the global market has to be strongly engaged in China. But getting more dependent on China is not exactly a strategy to strengthen Europe's open strategic autonomy. It's a strategy to make us more vulnerable to Chinese coercion and Chinese pressure. So I'm not even sure that what people have in mind when they say constructive dialogue is really all that constructive. But at least I would argue that it is also important if you want to look for cooperation. And of course, I would not reject cooperation where it's possible. But you cannot do cooperation under the Chinese dictate that you then have to ignore the conflicts and the contradictions. I just recently listened to a webinar where the Chinese foreign minister declared that China does not accept the Europeans' change of mind. They don't accept the European mindset. I mean, that sounds very much like paternal supervision to me. This is not the kind of relationship we want to have with China.
Yeah, and I suppose that kind of ties into China's view of the EU's relationship with the US. I suppose since Joe Biden took office earlier this year, there has been a shift, I suppose, in the allyship between the two trading blocs. Is the China's criticism of the EU, I suppose, being a lackey of the US, is that a fair criticism of the EU in terms of what we've seen recently, particularly with the sanctions that were imposed? They were in conjunction with the US and Canada.
The Chinese propaganda operates according to a very simplistic mindset. If you're criticizing the US as a European, then they applaud you for pursuing Europe's strategic autonomy. If you criticize China, then they call you a US running dog. So basically, Europe exercises its autonomy when it pleases China, and when it doesn't please China, it shouldn't be autonomous. I don't think that this makes for a very conducive cooperation.
And I guess looking forward, and you touched on it earlier when you mentioned Chancellor Angela Merkel leaving office later this year. The polls for the elections, the two kind of front runners at the moment have been quite open in how they plan to approach their relationship with the US, and that they want to kind of build a closer bond rather than reach out for closer ties with China. What does the election spell, I suppose, for the future of EU-China relations, in your view?
Well, under Chancellor Merkel, of late, Germany has become a kind of an outlier in Europe's China policy. The EU has agreed in spring of 2019 that we define our China relationship as a threefold relationship. China is a partner, a competitor, but also a systemic rival. The only European leader that has consistently refused to use the term systemic rivalry is Merkel. So she's not in sync with what the Council has agreed. She is pursuing her own China strategy, which is motivated, I think, by a deep mistrust of the US and an overly optimistic expectation for EU-China relations or German-Chinese relations. And that will change when she departs. Even within her own party, there are much more diverse opinions. And the chair of the German Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee, for instance, who is a former minister and from Merkel's party, is much closer to the position that I would have than to Merkel's position. And the liberals have become more critical. The foreign policy spokespeople of the Social Democratic Party are clearly more critical of China than Merkel is, our party anyhow. So in a way, there is a very funny coalition of the conservative part of the CDU and the conservative left party. Those two conservative forces are still panda huggers, but everybody else has become more realistic.
Yeah, and I suppose then with the kind of uncertainty of what's to come in terms of German elections and general political fallout, what would you like to see happen in the next, I suppose, year with EU-China relations, and what does the future hold? As I suppose, speaking as chair of the European Parliament's delegation on China.
Well, number one, when we look at the strong economic relationship, I think we should emphasize putting in place adequate autonomous protective measures, like the international procurement instrument that has just been agreed upon in the Council and will now be debated and hopefully concluded with the Parliament and the Commission in the trilogue. That would create more reciprocity in the procurement markets. We also need to protect European industries from unfair competition through subsidies that China hands out to their SOEs in particular, which would be and are indeed illegal under WTO terms, but China still does it. So we have to push back there. We should put in place a ban on the importation of products of forced labor into the European market. We should put in place the human rights due diligence legislation. We look at what happens to Australia from the Chinese side, where they try economic coercion. And then we know that we have to have an anti-coercive instrument to keep each other's backs if China tries to single out individual European countries, as they have tried to do in the past, targeting on Sweden or the Czech Republic, for instance. So that's a big agenda to develop our own autonomous measures. And I think we would do European industry and all of ourselves a big favor if we wouldn't lose time doing that. Secondly, I think we should team up with our American partners in the transatlantic relationship. Just last week, there was the first transatlantic dialogue on China between the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, and the External Action Services General Secretary, Sanino, to shape a common agenda. And they will set up probably 4 working groups dealing with different issues where transatlantic partners can work together. We should also understand that China doesn't exist in a vacuum. So for too long a time, Europe, when looking at Asia, would only see China. But there are, of course, also other partners. We recently had an EU-India summit, and there we struck on a connectivity agreement with the Indians, and we agreed to reopen trade negotiations with India. We have great opportunities of working with ASEAN, with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, New Zealand. I think that is also part of our China policy, to strengthen partners in the Indo-Pacific region that want this partnership because it helps them defending their own stakes and remaining players and not just be put under the heel of Beijing.
And just lastly, before I let you go, we're coming up to the anniversary, the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. I just wanted to get your view on how far China has come since then.
Well, China has become much richer. For a while after the terrible massacre in Tiananmen, China developed in a more lenient, maybe I should say, moderate, maybe direction. There were gray zones where NGOs could operate. There still was a political monopoly on all the levers of power for the Communist Party. And there was crackdown, and there were human rights abuses and repression in Tibet and so on. But there were limits to that. And since Xi Jinping has taken over, all the gray zones have been eliminated. And the limits on human rights oppression have been abolished. 10 years ago, we were talking about human rights cases where courageous lawyers defended people who had spoken up. Today, the lawyers themselves are in jail. And we've seen the change of track that Beijing has decided with regard to Hong Kong, where they've broken every and any promise they ever made to the Hong Kong citizens. They have broken international obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. China has, over the last 10 years, become a more oppressive power internally and a more aggressive power externally. And this is why we now have to also sort of reflect that change. We cannot operate as if nothing had happened in China. China has basically experienced a rollback from authoritarianism back to totalitarianism, to more strict authoritarianism, greater centralization of power, no division of powers anymore. So I think on the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, the global community should demonstrate that we're not forgetting, not just the mothers of the Tiananmen victims should keep up reminding everybody of what happened. We should also play our part. In the years since 1989, Hong Kong was a focus of keeping the memory alive. Last year, the Tiananmen vigil was not allowed, and a number of Hong Kong Democrats have now been put in jail for participating in the Hong Kong vigil last year. This year, the Hong Kong vigil is This year, the Hong Kong vigil is forbidden, and people are even threatened that if they walk on the street, creating the impression that they want to remind passersby of Tiananmen, they could be put in jail for 5 years. And an elderly lady known as Grandma Wang was detained under the accusation of having organized a demonstration of one, an illegal demonstration of one. She was just walking by herself and has been detained. So now I think we should step in, and I would invite everybody to light a candle on the 4th of June to, and for instance, show that in social media and demonstrate that we're not forgetting, and that we continue to show solidarity with the democratic struggles.
Reinhard, thank you.
Thank you very much.